Good evening, everyone. I am Namrata Yadav, Research Analyst at ISAS and MC for today's panel discussion. Thank you for joining ISAS panel discussion, Bay of Bengal, Challenges of Progressing on Connectivity and Trade in Uncertain Times. The BIMSTEC Charter was signed this year in March at the 5th Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technology and Economic Cooperation Summit in Colombo. However, as member economies still recover from recurrent waves of COVID-19 and domestic macroeconomic difficulties, it remains to be seen how signing of the Charter will accelerate regional connectivity and trade efforts among members. We hope that our esteemed members of the panel today will help us understand the challenges that lie ahead for BIMSTEC members before they meet again in 2024. Today, we are delighted to have with us the following panelists: Ms. Priyanka Kishore, Head of India and Southeast Asia Macro and Investor Services, Oxford Economics, Singapore; Dr. Mohammad Abdul Razak, Research Director, Policy Research Institute, Bangladesh; Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, Non-Resident Senior Fellow, ISAS, and Senior Research Associate, Overseas Development Institute, United Kingdom; and Dr. Constantino Xavier, Fellow Foreign Policy and Security Studies at Center for Social and Economic Progress, India. Today's session is moderated by Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics at ISAS. Before we proceed with the event, we would appreciate if the audience could switch off their microphones and videos throughout the session. The panelists are requested to keep their videos on. If you have any questions or feedback to share during the proceeding, please forward them via the chat box. They will be consolidated for the panelists to respond during the Q&A session later. This panel discussion is being live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. I now invite Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director at ISAS, to make the introductory remarks and welcome our panelists. Associate Professor Sevia, please.
Thank you, Namrata. Distinguished speakers and participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the ISAS webinar on the Bay of Bengal challenges of progressing on connectivity and trade in uncertain times. The BIMSTEC Charter was signed at the 5th Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technology and Economic Cooperation, or BIMSTEC, Summit in Colombo in March this year. The signing of this charter has formalized the grouping into an organization of member states that are literal to and dependent upon the Bay of Bengal. The structure and modalities have also been formalized. BIMSTEC members are now committed to meet every 2 years for regional connectivity and trade strategies. The summit in Colombo also witnessed the signing of a number of agreements. These include a memorandum of association on establishment of BIMSTEC Technology Transfer Facility and Convention on Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters. In addition to this, a master plan for transport connectivity was agreed upon. Members also agreed to designate each member to be in charge of a specific pillar of activity. These agreements and the signing of the charter reflect the expansion and evolution of the organization from the point at which it was established in 1997. They also reflect the growing geopolitical and geo-economic significance of the Bay of Bengal. While the development of a framework will go some way in the streamlining and formalizing of cooperation among member states across the Bay of Bengal, one should probably not expect an overnight transformation and immediate development of a cooperative architecture. At the time of signing, the host of the summit, Sri Lanka, was and remains in the throes of a serious economic and political crisis. It remains to be seen if BIMSTEC will be able to help in it. There are also concerns that Nepal may be following in Colombo's footsteps, with inflation as high as 7.2% and much of its external debt owed to international organizations. Nepal finds itself in macroeconomic difficulties. Given that all BIMSTEC member economies have been revising their industrial strategies in response to the episodic surges in COVID-19 pandemic, the charter comes at a crucial time. Of course, it is not just economic difficulties alone that are of concern to BIMSTEC members. The Bay of Bengal is increasingly the site of geopolitical contestation between India and China. As a result, BIMSTEC is an important forum for India. Indeed, for India, BIMSTEC is an attractive alternative to SAARC, which has been paralyzed as a result of India-Pakistan tensions. The position of Myanmar within BIMSTEC is also interesting. It provides both opportunities and challenges. From the perspective of the military junta in Myanmar, BIMSTEC is a forum that could provide some form of legitimization. After all, they were part of the latest meeting that was held virtually. With a view towards countering Chinese influence, India seems willing to engage with the military junta, but not too publicly. The hesitation to publicly engage seems to have been one reason for the summit being held virtually. The issue of the Rohingya refugees who have fled Myanmar into Bangladesh is also an issue that may test the willingness and ability of BIMSTEC to resolve issues between member states. Overall, the signing of the charter brings hope for productive arrangements for the BIMSTEC members. Currently, intra-regional trade within the member states amounts to US 70 billion. It remains to be seen if and how the momentum from the recent summit will provide a fillip to trade and infrastructure networks across and among the member countries. We're delighted to have with us today an eminent panel comprising speakers from Singapore, South Asia, and Europe with significant experience, and Bangladesh as well, and knowledge on subject matter. They will reflect on key issues impacting BIMSTEC and propose the way forward. Following the webinar, ISES will explore the possibility of putting the key discussion points into a special report. We will share that with you in due time. With that, I wish you all a rewarding and engaging discussion. Thank you, and over to you, Namrata.
Thank you, Professor Sivia. I now request Dr. Palit to begin today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Namrata, and I join Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sivia, Director ISAS, and my colleague, and the rest of my colleagues at ISAS, and welcoming the eminent panelists for this conversation here today. Thank you so much for taking you off from your busy commitments and sparing time for sharing your insights with us. I also want to thank the audience that we have with us today, and it's not just the people who have joined us through the Zoom platform. This event is being simultaneously live streamed on the Facebook, and there will be a lot of attendees who have been able to connect to us through that live stream. So welcome, all of you. What we are about to dive deep into today is the subject of connectivity in the Bay of Bengal region, but looked at in totality, it is probably a microcosm of a large number of concerns, which the Asian region, the Asia-Pacific region, and specific sub-regions of Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the broader Indo-Pacific is experiencing at this point in time. We are all aware of the importance of connectivity. We are all aware of the space which the Bay of Bengal region, and Professor Sivia referred to the recent conclusion of the BIMSTEC summit. BIMSTEC, as you know, is the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral and Technical Economic Cooperation. Comprises economies which are on the Bay of Bengal rim, 5 from the South Asian region, 2 from the Southeast Asian region. Now, for all of these economies, and much as it has been for several other economies of the world, the last 2 to 2.25 years have been very turbulent for a large number of reasons. It's not just the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic is, of course, a once-in-a-lifetime kind of occurrence. It is probably the rarest of the rare black swans that can impact lives and livelihoods. But more importantly, there are a series of other events which appear to have got somehow connected in and around the COVID-19 episodes, which have tended to make the entire question of putting a virtuous focus and consistent focus on connectivity a very challenging task. Professor Sivia again mentioned to the developments that have been taking place in Myanmar, and this happened from well before the COVID-19. It does not yet show any signs of getting resolved. There are more and more conflicts which are becoming commonplace. We are aware of what happened in Afghanistan, which is not too far from the Bay of Bengal countries. We are aware of what is going on in the sort of Central Asia region between Russia and Ukraine. And there are very critical developments that are taking place within a large number of countries around Bay of Bengal and very close to the Bay of Bengal. Political changes, political upheavals, economic chaos, economic distress mounting up, and greater global economic and social pressures arising through high energy prices, high food prices, peculiar and complicated regulations that are arising in various parts of the world. At the same time, there are very remarkable developments taking place across the technological space and digitalization space, which are perhaps welcoming, which are also creating new challenges for regulators and the end users. Supply chains continue to remain disrupted. So all in all, what we are getting to see, and for economies in a region for whom connectivity and the sustained progress on connectivity is very important, is a concern that is arising over the prospects of funding and investments. We are all aware of the fact that infrastructure funding has never been a simple matter. Infrastructure funding has always been a difficult issue, not just because of the size of the funds involved in infrastructure, but also because of the returns and the length of time it takes to produce the right amount of returns. And also because today, there are issues around pricing of infrastructure services. There are issues around standards of infrastructure. It's no more a question of just delivering and going ahead with the service, but it's more a question of also being compatible with standards such as those of sustainable development, such as those of clean energy, and a large number of other connected issues. To sum it up, the challenge of retaining a sustained focus on connectivity for the Bay of Bengal region has probably never been more difficult than what we experienced at that point in time. The good part is that there are countries which continue to remain focused on the objective, but at the same time, perhaps there are limitations to which countries can do at a national level, because ultimately, connectivity is a game that needs to be played by all actors. Businesses, producers, consumers, governments, everybody has to come together to make the best of connectivity. And it's precisely these interactions, these challenges that are impacting investment outlook, and the character of connectivity growth that we are going to examine today with this extremely distinguished panel, to which I now turn, and I want to invite Priyanka Kishore for her perspectives. Priyanka, a macroeconomic perspective of the way investments are looking to move into major sectors that are decisive for connectivity, not just projects, but in terms of parking themselves into the Bay of Bengal region. We would love to hear your thoughts on that. If you could now have your say, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Palit. First of all, thank you, ISAS, for inviting me to this panel. It's very topical, and unfortunately, with so many summits, things like this tend to get lost in the news flow these days, especially when you're so focused on Ukraine war and things like that. But really, the BIMSTEC summit and India's renewed drive in driving this, bringing this partnership back to forefront. It is something definitely to keep an eye on. A lot of talk about whether this compensates for RCEP. I'm not going into that. My fellow panelists are much better placed to talk about it. But clearly an interesting turn of events, I would say. And to that extent, I think it's very correct, Dr. Palit, that you're focused much more on connectivity and investment to begin with. Some of the critiques have said that, the absence of a free trade agreement is somewhat of a disappointment. But I think the existing FTAs, for example, the India-ASEAN FTA shows that, unless you have connectivity, the FTAs never really realize their potential. So it's important to have that logistics in place in terms of roads, ports, etc. And BIMSTEC is unique in that sense, right? Because you have Southeast Asia and you have South Asia. It's one of the forums that's kind of an overlap. And indeed, one of the things that they did do in this meeting was adopt the master plan for connectivity, the blueprint for which has been drawn up by ADB. And it says that at the core of its objective is to actually establish a plan for greater connectivity between South and Southeast Asia. So I think that is really what this organization, this partnership is bringing to the table. Although it is more of a geopolitical agreement rather than, something like RCEP, which is primarily an economic partnership. I do think that, this is something unique that BIMSTEC is bringing to the table. Now, how likely is it to be realized? You've discussed at length that funding is a challenge. If I just quote some basic figures from the master plan, they're talking about 141 flagship projects. So, something that already probably includes the Asian Trilateral Highway, which hopefully now we see completed by 2023. And then they're talking about 267 additional projects. So at the minimum, the bill is close to 50 billion. If you include all the projects, it goes upwards of 100 billion. And there are only so many funds available. And the challenge really is that which countries are beginning to, are willing to take up this investment? Where do they see the gains coming from? Now, theoretically, of course, much is to be reaped. Nobody is disputing that. Regional integration has become even more important with the deglobalization story gaining even more traction because of the events happening globally. But having said that, even within Asia, there are competing demands. RCEP is competing for investment, for example, again, BIMSTEC. And then how do you allocate or where do you allocate? So if I look at how do you gain from this, if I were trying to put it in that perspective, so much has been made about, how India gains from this because it establishes Northeast Asia as a conduit for trade with Southeast Asia, for example. But it's equally important for ASEAN, I would say. I mean, they were really keen to have India as a part of RCEP and hugely disappointed when they did not pan out. And in some sense, if they go into this, promote the connectivity, put their money here, it gives them their economic reach expands a lot more into another large economy, which is what they were looking for. But I'm also going to add, I think the challenges to that are big. First of all, ASEAN FDI has turned even more intra-regional following RCEP. We are seeing Singapore, Indonesia, they're all investing. Thailand is investing into Vietnam. So we are seeing them prioritizing Southeast Asia investment over the rest of the world. And I think that is something that is at least likely to continue in the near term. And then the reason for that is that they are much more comfortable with their FDI policies, their FDI environment, and the security that they see in terms of the returns it would generate. Whereas the South Asian economies, in general, and this also probably included India until a few years back. Now we have seen much more improvement in ease of doing business rankings, suffer from, contract enforcements, a stable FDI policy environment. And as you've already discussed, crises erupting in Sri Lanka, maybe Nepal, next in line debt issues galore. So there's not a kind of a stable macroeconomic and a policy environment, and BIMSTEC doesn't have the institutional strength in place, which ASEAN has at this point of time to actually attract the funds away immediately. So it's going to be a long game, and I don't really want to stretch my opening remarks too much, but I would extend this, to conclude to the other players who are watching this space and trying to decide where they get their bang for the buck. For example, Japan. So a lot has been made about, how Japan could actually become a dialogue partner, first an observer and then a dialogue partner for BIMSTEC and increase its involvement. But the truth is that at a political level, despite the growing involvement of Japan with India, on the ground level, when they're talking about China plus one strategy, we're still seeing more fund flows going to ASEAN from Japan rather than India. So there are practicalities, and I think at this point of time, the onus is very much on India and Thailand to drive this from within to gain momentum on the infrastructure front. So to that end, it is encouraging, that they share common visions in terms of, for example, extending the trilateral highway to the East-West corridor. So, you make inroads into Southeast Asia beyond BIMSTEC. You're going into Laos, you're going to Vietnam. And as that happens, that generates a positive environment for other countries to, increase their investment in the region. So definitely a long haul out there, I would say.
Thank you, Priyanka. I think you have raised a few very pertinent points. If I could sort of describe those that way. The first of it is, of course, the question that the role of BIMSTEC, and more importantly, the capacity of the BIMSTEC to actually act as an institutional accelerator in getting investments. going into the game around the question of connectivity. That has to be something which needs to come up for discussion. But more importantly, Priyanka, I think there's a way forward from what you have mentioned to us. It's not that there are not investment funds. There are investment funds, but it seems that when we look at the region of Bay of Bengal, somehow that region is not yet totally clued in firmly or in a long-term basis when it comes to sources of investments, maybe from ASEAN or from other parts of the world, including the Asia Pacific. Now, if that is the question, then what that means is that notwithstanding the externalities that we have mentioned earlier, COVID, conflict, so on and so forth, capital is moving, and capital is moving into long-term projects. But perhaps that movement is not getting to be substantially directed towards the Bay of Bengal region. I think that is an idea which we need to explore with the rest of the panelists. And with that in mind, can I now invite Dr. Mohammad Razak, my very old friend and colleague. Razak, firstly, thank you for joining this. I know you have had a long flight and it must have been troubling for you. So thank you so much. But taking this conversation forward from where Priyanka left it off, I think one of the questions that the Bay of Bengal region and the countries in the Bay of Bengal region need to sort of face upfront is that there have been, most of them at least, have been net importers of capital. And it's not just a question of private capital, it's also a question of institutional funding. It's a question of country funding that is coming into the story at a time when the conditions of most of these economies in the region are not particularly bright. I mean, perhaps Bangladesh and India are two economies in the region till now, and maybe Thailand, which are kind of not as precariously disposed as some other economies of the region are. But who knows? I mean, the conditions might unfold in such a way over the next 5 to 6 months that the economic outlook might suddenly worsen. What would be your take on the way investments can move into the connectivity space in the region? Over to you, Razak.
Thank you, Dr. Palit. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity and being part of this panel. And a special thanks to Priyanka Kishore for nicely giving us some clues, like where the discussions can be elaborated. Before I respond to your question, please allow me to give a bit of my own broad perspective. And I think I would like to bring in several other issues that are affected. Quite rightly, in this webinar, you are focusing on the short-term issues or the emerging issues and how that is impacting or having an impact on the regional integration agenda, especially for the BIMSTEC region. That point is well taken. But if you look globally as well, then what I would say that, and I think all of you are going to agree with me on this, there have been certain fundamental developments that are taking place. And those are going to shape or reshape the whole regional integration agenda as such. I think especially for the Bay of Bengal region. You see, at one point, you recall that you and I, we wrote about how mega regionals are going to sort of undermine the multilateral trading system. Now then, with the subdued activities or stalling of the WTO processes, we have seen those mega regionals they have failed to emerge, especially the failure of TPP and TTIP. We all are aware of this. So that is happening. So despite a lot of enthusiasm about the regional integration or greater regional agenda, we haven't seen much impact taking place. And hardly we have seen in our region as well, SAFTA, how ineffective it has been over many, many years. Now, the issue here is, I think, in recent times, I think only two major regional integration initiatives that we have seen is the Vietnam-EU FTA, but which was long coming, and it has eventually been materialized. And then the other one is the African initiative, the AFCTA. Now, the problem is that one being the African one is being the new one, and its problem prospects will be very much in line with the textbook mechanisms that we have always discussed. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is this: you see, we have also seen another type of paradigm that has contributed to international trade mechanism and regional integration, which is the GVC and the role of different countries into the GVC processes. But in that GVC processes, you would recall that there are two major trends. One is only a few countries have been benefited from the process, and in our continent, it's basically the East Asian countries that they have benefited from the process. But even those, when the benefits have been materialized, I think there has been a recognition that not much value added into the whole GVC process has been generated. Just contrast two countries, Vietnam and Bangladesh, they used to export the similar kind of volume of exports in 1990, both exported around $1.5 billion. And then Vietnam's current export is about $336 billion. Bangladesh is just around above $40 billion. See the big difference. But if you look at the growth numbers, you would say Bangladesh and Vietnam, they have done more or less the same. And especially the fact that despite having an export volume of $336 billion, Vietnam's GDP growth to some extent is lower than Bangladesh. So people are asking, the way the ultra export led growth, paradigm was proposed to be a game changer, perhaps that is not happening. And the reason being, too much emphasis on the global value chain led trade means the value added created out of these trade is small, and only a few countries have benefited, if at all, from South Asian countries. So that is one issue. So the point I'm trying to make here is this: the South
Razak, I think there's some disturbance that we are facing with you. Can you hear us?
India,
Yeah,
they are getting quite respect undertaking major, right? So what I'm saying is this: you see, the India and Bangladesh, they have been able to have I think decent and respectable growth without undertaking any serious dose of liberalization since the mid 1990s, and to some extent Bangladesh has become even more protectionist in its approach, but it's still managing to get very high growth rates. So when you talk about this regional connectivity agenda, that is nothing but a part of the whole liberalization agenda that you would like to pursue. Say. So that is why we're not seeing that kind of dynamism that is taking place. Now, the other issue that has been now a major feature in international arena is the rise of the new geopolitical or geoeconomic trend that we are seeing, where China and India are playing the key role here. Now, the problem with this kind of thing, any regional integration mechanism in the world now can be seen through the prism of the new geopolitical trends that we are seeing. And there, how we are going to deal with China is becoming very important. Why? Because China is not like any other country. China is different because of two things. It has the cash and the investment ability, and it can take the investment anywhere. And also, unlike any other countries and any institution in the world, Chinese has that proven capacity of making those investment operationalized within a short period of time. Now, we can always highlight the fact of this debt diplomacy kind of thing, the danger of having that kind of huge investment. That's a different thing. But what I'm saying is this: any country like Bangladesh, they will be keen to ensure or secure their export market access into China, and also to be able to receive more investment opportunities coming from China. Rather than making my initial remarks longish, I would just like to say is this. So when you consider that particular element into the picture, I think BIMSTEC or Bay of Bengal Initiative will have to be thought through, I think, even more clearly, what we're trying to achieve here. Otherwise, I think we're not going to make any progress. I think that is very clear. I think for the time being, we all are in an unsettled place. You see, we do not know what should be the strategy to pursue. And if we're not going to define it clearly, even in terms of India's objective, what it wants to achieve, then perhaps this initiative won't go ahead. That's the thing. But to be honest, the point that I would like to make is this simple point. Just like tariff liberalization, your connectivity agenda is also a liberalization game, and you need to play this. And the second thing is, even if the China is away from us or not part of Bay of Bengal Initiative, Chinese economy and Chinese investment power are extremely important in defining what other countries are going to do in the over the next decade or so. I'd like to stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Razak, and thank you as always for being sharp, for being candid, and also drawing our attention to those issues which are sensitive but which matter a lot. Because unless and until these issues are addressed in their totality and in whole comprehension, perhaps we miss the complete picture, and we keep wondering as to why what we were expecting is not materializing the way they should have. So thank you for bringing up those subjects on which certainly we are going to come back to you again. Ganesh, I think Razak has set the stage admirably after Priyanka for you to come in there, because much of what Razak has alluded to, the questions of the supply chains and the way they have in a sense been a facilitator for connectivity if we look at the Southeast Asian experience, because minus connectivity in the region, the supply chains could not have flourished the way they have. And the converse could also be true, that they have also been an accelerator towards charging connectivity. And then most importantly, Razak raised the question of China. I mean, in my initial observations, I did draw attention to the fact that there are extra-regional actors which have now started taking a very active role and interest in the prospects of connectivity in the region, notably Japan, Australia. But we can't forget the contributions of China in this regard, the interest and the controversy that it has come with it. And nobody knows this better from you from a Sri Lankan experience. So let me now invite you, Ganesh, for sharing your perspectives on the subject. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amitendu, and I'm very grateful to Iqbal and you for having me here. I'm going to talk briefly on the outcome of the Colombo summit and why that was important for BIMSTEC coming of age, if you like. And then I'm going to talk about the unfinished agenda, and I'll try to frame it in this connectivity context that you have asked me to do. In terms of the Colombo summit, I mean, it was a major milestone when you look at some of the things that came out from the charter, the master plan, and you also had the BIMSTEC Convention on Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters. So there were important things. And then we hope that the motor vehicle agreement and the coastal shipping agreement will come in the future. And so you're going to get, at least for the land bit of BIMSTEC, better connectivity, right? It's the sea bit, the Sri Lankas of this world, that may have some wanting here. So I think it was very important, that we should, underscore that point, right? Let me just come to the unfinished agenda, and I have sort of 6 things that I'll briefly mention that I think are relevant here to make BIMSTEC much more useful. The first is really this infrastructure point that both Priyanka and Razak mentioned. And as we all know, the financing of infrastructure is terribly important, and there's this big gap. And the master plan, as Priyanka said, has 141 projects with $100 billion or so of money that's needed. Now, there are different ways that you may estimate, this infrastructure investment gap. And I have done an alternative calculation that puts the number at 120 billion per year until 2030 that BIMSTEC needs to invest. So it's a significantly bigger number than what you get in the master plan, okay? And even my figure is probably an underestimate. You need a huge investment to get the 5G going, the 5th generation of mobile network technology in the BIMSTEC region. And that's not quite captured in my number. and nor does it really capture, the extent of multimodal connectivity systems that you need to get BIMSTEC going. Air, sea, land, rail, road, those are big numbers, right? And also energy corridors, and energy trade is a big area. So I think that number in the plan is an underestimate that's needed. Now, the operationalization of this plan is terribly important, as people have said, and we're going to have to think of, financing it. And, we have to think of fiscal space, which is very short, as we know. The PPP issue looms large. But I think India is the only country in South Asia that has tried PPPs with mixed record, as you know, but we have to try to persevere. And we have to look at capital markets. Infrastructure bonds are going to be important. Green bonds, I think, particularly important. In the case of countries like Sri Lanka, swapping environment for debt may be important. These kinds of things, environmentally friendly, sustainable technologies, infrastructure, and so on. Now, coming to China, China is a mixed blessing. As I look at not just Sri Lanka, but other countries, there are at least 3 points that I'd like to sort of underscore, and I want to sort of have a side discussion with Razak on this. But, this Chinese debt trap narrative is what Sri Lanka is famous for, but also now the Maldives and the whole bunch of countries in Africa and so on and so forth. There are at least 3 things we've got to do to try to avoid that. The first is you've got to have very good national infrastructure master planning. That's one point that's important. Countries have to know what infrastructure they need. They have to prioritize. They have to put numbers to it and so on. The second thing, which is also missed out, is very detailed cost-benefit analysis for individual projects to actually look at those returns, right? And in many countries, we haven't done that kind of CBA type analysis with proper shadow pricing. The third thing you've got to do is to have very strong anti-corruption policies, because one of the things that comes out of much of these BRI projects is that you have these state-owned enterprises wandering around, and there is a great potential for rent seeking. And this is most apparent in the highways, by the way, where you can inflate the costs very highly. But it's also the case in the power plant. So this big infrastructure really has governance issues attached to it there. The second point I want to make very briefly is coming back to Priyanka's point about the policy framework in ASEAN versus BIMSTEC. I think BIMSTEC can do something on the debt issue. And I think this debt distress we talked about earlier is a big problem. And I think BIMSTEC countries can advocate collectively for a debt standstill, temporary debt standstill for official and private creditors for those countries that are debt distressed. And that would be very important. They can also have an independent expert group on debt sustainability and transparency and management so that good practices get exchanged. And they can support an argument for an IMF program expansion to middle-income countries and countries in special circumstances, which I think would be important. The third area really is this whole 5G thing that I mentioned earlier. And I think BIMSTEC really has to do a lot of work on the non-hard part of connectivity. We have to really look at this 5G thing very carefully and look at not only the infrastructure part, but the regulatory approach to e-commerce, which I think is important. In a country like Sri Lanka, the e-commerce market is only $100 million, which is very, very little. And I think a lot more can be done to encourage cross-border e-commerce. And it's important because it's something under the radar of government. So in a way, one is becoming skeptical sometimes of government intervention. And I think e-commerce is a very good area where regulatory approaches can be very light. The fourth thing is this FTA. And I think the FTA becomes important. It's a long-running saga. And it's very important to help get rules of origin that can enable the trade to flow between BIMSTEC countries. And we've talked a lot about deep FTAs, but I think basically if we bring together the least common denominator items in at least the trade tariff part and the non-tariff measures and put that together and call that a victory, and then we use a kind of an accumulative process to build up the FTA, I think that would be okay as a start, rather than trying to aim for this high standard thing, which I think will take a long time. And that would be a very important political signal and possibly enable trade to go better. So that would be, take the least the least contentious elements of what there is, even if there are exclusions. I think a bottom-up approach to that FTA would be important, rather than trying to aim for a high standard FTA, which would be very difficult initially, at least. And then you try to build that over time. And I think the e-commerce chapters and other things may be again areas which support can be given. The fifth area is something that I feel very strongly. I think we really have to have BIMSTEC arguing for gender equality in education and the workplace, and for women to have the same opportunities as men in education and for paid work. And I think this, Amartya Sen once said, if you remember, investing $1 in girls' education is the best bet any developing country can do, right? And this is the best way. And I think that will encourage jobs, income, entrepreneurship across BIMSTEC countries. The sixth item, I think, is something that's really critical, is really the BIMSTEC Charter and ensuring this kind of development agenda in BIMSTEC gets upgraded. And then we have to empower the secretariat. I mean, the secretariat, needs to be adequately resourced. It needs to have delegated powers to act as a coordinator. And that's a big gap, by the way, Priyanka, with ASEAN, right? I mean, ASEAN has 100-odd people. They have something of a fund, a couple of $1 billion or something. They do proper monitoring to some extent. The countries are more engaged. BIMSTEC has one SG plus 7 country directors drawn from the countries, and that's it, right? And there's very little technical capacity. The foreign ministries which support BIMSTEC in the national countries are ill-equipped to handle and understand BIMSTEC. There's one officer who handles often in countries, BIMSTEC, SAARC, and everything else. I mean, it's just hopeless, right? They don't involve the think tanks properly. So I think we need to do a lot of work. And I think, Prime Minister Modi's suggestion of $1 million to increase the operational budget, I think is a good step, but the others have to join. And I think Thailand has to do lots of heavy lifting. And we need to do a lot of capacity building if we want BIMSTEC to work. And that capacity building is not just the 7 people who are there plus the Secretary General, but how they link with think tanks. And hopefully ISAS can play a role and others in this process, right? So in conclusion, I think the Colombo Summit is very important for its achievements, and it's a milestone compared to what has been there before. And summit didn't take place during COVID, but really, if we're going to build this connectivity agenda, we have to at least pick those 6 things that I think are important, and that includes the financing bit of the infrastructure part, and I think the PPPs is important. We've got to try to look at the digital agenda, and particularly e-commerce, which is something that should not be too controversial. We have to look at the FTA, and I would suggest a minimum FTA is better than no FTA at all, and put that extras to bed. We have to look at gender, because women, I think, are a very powerful driver, and in terms of people-to-people contact, I think can be terribly important in ensuring that SMEs and women workers and academics and others interact, and I think that would be a key part. And last, we have to look at the secretariat, and it's hopeless to keep talking about 7 people and so on and expecting much result. Thanks a lot. I've taken too much time, but I hope this in-tray for Thailand's agenda comes into play, and I think would be very useful. Thanks a lot, Amit.
Ganesh, really, like always, fantastic. And it's very clear. I mean, the depth that you bring into this conversation, the years that you have spent in looking at the issues on the region. And of course, the forward-looking content that you bring onto the table, that there are perhaps issues that you raised, the question of bringing women into the mainstream of development within the region, the issue of taking up e-commerce as a separate agenda, and a number of other connected subjects, which have really begun occupying the conversation across the world and the trade and business and investment communities in an engaging fashion. BIMSTEC really, really needs to devote much more time into these matters to see what extent they can stay connected, because otherwise, I think as a matter of observation, it's very obvious that even the extra-regional actors who are interested in future well-being and prospects of the Bay of Bengal region might ultimately feel disenchanted by the way the region is able to react and respond to the upcoming changes and cross-cutting issues across the world. Thank you so much for that, Ganesh. And well, Dr. Constantino Javier, my good friend, and I think a wealth of knowledge and expertise on the subject of connectivity in South Asia. Tino, I won't blame you if you think that there is a bit of a cynicism doing the rounds right now insofar as how much BIMSTEC will be able to achieve and deliver. Now, that is something on which I would certainly want to have your thoughts. But what I would also, in addition to that, want to know from you is that while being based in the region, working with the BIMSTEC issues, focusing on connectivity, if today, say, for example, you want to look at the countries agencies, sources from where funding can flow into Bay of Bengal for accelerating connectivity. Who do you think are the best bets for the region at this point in time? Over to you, Tino.
Thank you, Amitendo. Wonderful to see you and be in such great company here with our colleagues and experts. And thank you to ISAS, Professor Iqbal Singh and his wonderful team of researchers for putting this together, and you, Amitendo, for also steering this long-term agenda on connectivity, regional integration, interdependence. Amitendo, I think cynicism is maybe the evil twin of patience and pragmatism, something this region, I think, all teaches us, that things take time. Good things in particular take time. I think we're in an important moment now in South, Southeast, Bay of Bengal regions. Things are happening. We've tried before, but I think there's something new to the moment we are in. So there is, I think, almost what I would call more than a resource curse. We have a connectivity curse, right? There's a lot happening, too much happening in many ways. Countries are being pressured with different expectations, different plans, different roadmaps, different ambitions, different, like you mentioned, actors, whether bilateral relationships. We spoke about China, we can speak about Japan, we can speak about the ADB, about the AIIB, about ASEAN, about BIMSTEC. There's really this sort of proliferation of initiatives and possibilities. And I think actually from a scarcity, and I think we are now moving very quickly to the opposite extreme of excessive plentiness of options, which makes it all the more important to have these discussions, to discuss, strategize, sequence, harmonize, coordinate how different countries in this region and different actors beyond the region are operating to correct this connectivity gap in the Bay of Bengal. And I think, if I may, just quickly mention of why this matters. I think it's quite clear, in my predecessors on this panel have now, I think, diagnosed the issues quite well. And I'll just focus on sort of three challenges on how we can correct this gap. One of them is being, in fact, one fact being extra-regional actors. But I think we all agree to sort of initial points that the diagnostic is clear. The Bay of Bengal used to be, in many ways, in absolute terms, more connected in the past than it is today. That's a paradox. When the whole world over the last 50 years embraced regional integration, interdependence, this region actually fell apart. We also know that this state of things, of disconnectivity, is leaving everyone worse off. Not only countries in the region, in South and Southeast Asia, but also beyond. This is the heart of the Indo-Pacific, of which we talk so much about. If this space at the cusp really of the Indian and Pacific Oceans does not get integrated, I think we can give up on any integration agenda, right? If India, the US, China, Japan, Southeast Asian countries are not able to correct this gap right here in the Bay of Bengal, then we can talk all we want about Indo-Pacific or Belt and Road Initiative or big visions, but nothing will really happen. In our work, we've come across, really acute indicators of lack of connectivity. I think Priyanka mentioned intra-regional trade. We know those figures of how low intra-regional trade is in the Bay of Bengal region, how bad flight connectivity and transportation connectivity is. If you're in Delhi today and you want to take a train out of this region, the only way is westwards. In fact, actually, there's not a single train that can get you out of India these days. The India-Pakistan rail link is not operational. But if that was operational as it has been in the past, you could take a train from here to Lisbon, but you cannot take a train from Delhi to Bangkok or Yangon or Singapore. If you're in Tehran and you'd like to have a single train connection to Southeast Asia, you'd have to do today a link via China, which has now inaugurated its most recent North-South Southeast Asia link between Yunnan and Thailand and Laos. So this is a state of connectivity without shipping, trade, no seaport on Thailand's west coast, for example. It's easier for nationals from the US or China or Singapore to get a tourism visa for the BIMSTEC countries than for BIMSTEC nationals to get a tourism visa to visit another BIMSTEC neighboring country, another indicator of disconnectivity. So I think that's all clear. The objective is also clear that this is not sustainable. We need tremendous infrastructure investment in basic multimodal transportation systems. We also need broader, sort of beyond the hard transportation connectivity, legal and regulatory harmonization of connectivity, trade investment agreements, mutual recognition agreements, harmonization of standards, data sharing and privacy regulations, the use of technology and data sharing. All of those are important. Now, the three, I think, challenges that to correct all this that I see ahead are the following. One is what I've mentioned about the connectivity curse in terms of the increasing number and potential redundancy and overlap of various connectivity initiatives. There's really a race going on, right? You have China and the Belt and Road Initiative. You have Japan, its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. You have India really embracing an Act East, neighborhood first, Bay of Bengal connectivity ambition. You have the US now pitching for an Indo-Pacific economic framework and focusing connectivity. You have the Australians just announced a connectivity initiative for the Northeast Indian Ocean with Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka. You have then various international financial institutions. You have the ADB that has been very active, in many ways a pioneer to correct this gap with its SASEC program. Then you now have the AIIB showing up. Nepal, for example, 2016 just became a new member of the AIIB. You have the World Bank trying to correct this gap by integrating its various country representations and its regional strategies. So I think this is the first challenge. Related to that is what we spoke already on the weakness of regional institutions. Here, I may become a bit more optimistic, but I get a sense that Thailand is really committed to BIMSTEC. The summit has been announced provisionally for August next year. And I think there is some potential for BIMSTEC to be revived and play that role. I think that Dr. Ganeshan has mentioned has been a handicap for the institution, which is its lack of autonomy, its lack of expertise, its lack of finances, its lack of really of power to drive that agenda. And finally, on the coordination, cooperation agenda of this sort of crowded variety of levels of connectivity, there's also something that I would like to draw the attention to that is beyond regional organizations, formal institutions and strategies and bilateral organizations, partnerships. There's something called regional regimes, very sectoral oriented areas of cooperation. I'm thinking of the Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, for example, quadrilateral, the BBIN. This is something that has emerged slowly in the 90s, has now been revived, but it's really a sort of what we call in old international organizations say regimes. It's not really a regional organization with a secretariat, but it's focused on 3-4 areas among these 4 countries at different speeds, where there's sort of an integration effort between these countries on water sharing, on motor vehicle agreements. And I think that's also something that is worth exploring instead of the heavy top-down regional organizations. The second challenge I'd like to draw attention to is on the institutional resilience of countries in the Bay of Bengal region to absorb these connectivity initiatives and to implement them. Again, you look at a country like Nepal today, like Bangladesh, like Sri Lanka, they're all very ambitious to try to escape their low income traps or the middle income traps in the case of Thailand, for example. They're embracing all these connectivity initiatives. But the question really is, what is their sort of institutional capacity to do 5 things when you think about connectivity initiatives? For example, an infrastructure project or a data sharing agreement with another country. You have to assess the merits and the problems of that initiative. So you need technical competence for that in terms of bureaucracy and expertise. B, you need to select and take a strategic decision of who to go with, what initiative you want to embrace, or which partner country, international financial institution. C, you need to have the capacity to implement these projects on the ground after you assess and select them. Fourth, D, you need to operate them. which means basically have the capacity to operate these infrastructure initiatives, whether it's, again, a bridge or an airport or some type of data sharing connectivity systems. And finally, you have to sustain them in the long term. So I think that's going to be a tremendous challenge for many of these countries, which underscores the importance, I would say the relative importance of partner countries that are interested in correcting the connectivity gap in the Bay of Bengal region, to put in, I think, the marginal utility of every dollar or euro or any currency that goes into technical capacity building, institutional capacity, skilling labor force, making it technically capable, supporting bureaucracy to assess, monitor projects. That capacity building dimension, I think, is critical. And that's where I think most countries have tremendous expertise that could share with the Bay of Bengal region. The last challenge, and I end with this, is something as simple as politics. And let me explain what I mean by politics. But three levels of politics we need to correct this connectivity gap in the Bay of Bengal. One is the basic imperative of stability, security, and peace. I think we've mentioned, I think Amitendo, you mentioned in your introductory remarks, the bad news. Myanmar, of course, with growing levels of conflict. Sri Lanka, we see these days panning out in a very negative way. So basic instability, that's not good. But there's also good news, I would say. You know, we have had political and governance stability in India and Bangladesh. Look at a region like the northeast region of India that is central to any Bay of Bengal connectivity, but northeast India today has the lowest level of political violence we've seen in decades, and a tremendous progress on various connectivity initiatives linking up the northeast region to Bangladesh and to Myanmar. The second political level that is important, I'd say, is what we call norms, values, standards, and the governance, the normative governance aspects of connectivity. And this underpins all sectors. So when we speak about inclusiveness, openness, accountable, transparent infrastructure, we're talking also about environmentally, socially, and politically responsible projects, right, of connectivity. That dimension, I think, deserves more work and attention in terms of that political sustainability, transparency, and embeddedness of economic connectivity projects in respective countries. And the last political element, maybe the most difficult one, is leadership, political leadership to sell connectivity at home in the Bay of Bengal countries. Governments oscillate often, I think, in sort of the quick imperatives of connectivity and economic assistance from abroad to develop their infrastructure, etc. But these projects, connectivity projects, and the external dimension, whether it's China, the US, Japan, ASEAN, BIMSTEC, anything that is external and looks at internal connectivity projects is having an increasing high risk of politicization of politics. These projects are coming under popular scrutiny. Governments are formed and disbanded often on important connectivity projects that become so polemic that they mobilize people for or against. So I think that's going to be very important for, I think, a leadership in these countries to be able to have a pragmatic approach to these connectivity initiatives, take informed decisions, and then also sell them to their public as being in their country's interests. I'll end with this. Thank you, Amitendo.
Well, Tino, that was really phenomenal. I think you put out the diverse range of priorities, the challenges, their interface in such a comprehensive and clear fashion. I mean, it's reflective of the deep connection that you have had with the subject, and really it's amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to come back to you, but I have a number of questions which I really want to toss back and forth between you guys. But I guess that with the limitation of time that I have, I won't be able to toss everything, but probably limit myself to a few. So Priyanka, if I can come back to you with a question. I think, we have been talking about BIMSTEC, the role of BIMSTEC, and BIMSTEC hasn't really distinguished itself. It's been in existence for 20 years. So just 5 summits, not a great amount of progress in a large number of areas. But as Tino highlighted, there are probably far more challenges that the BIMSTEC faces than many other organizations. And there's also this inevitable comparison that it faces vis-a-vis its peer regional organizations, the ASEAN, in Europe, in Latin America, so on and so forth. But I wanted to check with you, Priyanka. You have looked at Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific for a number of years, and you have been in touch with investors. When investors from this part of the world, let's say from ASEAN or from Asia Pacific or from East Asia, when they look at Bay of Bengal and when they look at BIMSTEC, is there a question of they're being predetermined with certain mindsets, in the sense that is there a view that, well, what really can we expect from this organization or from this region? They, as it is, are in a bit of a mess, always continue to be in a mess. Do you think that that kind of a mindset, and of course that mindset is not entirely without reasons. I mean, the region, the Bay of Bengal economies, some of them haven't always particularly distinguished themselves in bringing clarity on policies and a large number of other factors. But do you think there is a mindset factor which might, in a way, at least come in the decision making of private investors, private infrastructure, long-term investors, when they look at the Bay of Bengal region from this part of the world?
Good question. I'm just going to say something in BIMSTEC's defense to begin with, because I think I started off the cynicism in some way. But to pick up a point that Dr. Ganeshan made, you look at ASEAN Economic Community with the amount of manpower behind them. I wouldn't say that the AEC has actually managed to achieve that much over and beyond, what they already had in terms of, free trade agreements in place, etc. And the actual flow of labor, which AEC was supposed to promote, basically fell down, and it's the lack of political will, as Constantino rightly mentioned. So, I think that all political partnerships in that sense, and that's why, to me, RCEP or Eurozone, they're very different. They're very oriented with an economic agenda. They have a target in terms of what they're trying to achieve, which is probably more feasible in terms of, multilateral trade agreement, where otherwise, you're going with an open book, and we've already listed, Dr. Ganeshan has listed the number of issues that BIMSTEC could actually look at, and that's just not actually focused on connectivity or anything else. I mean, you could talk about gender issues, etc., and doesn't have enough people to do it on, as rightly said. So BIMSTEC hasn't done much for 20 years. It's suddenly gaining a lot of traction because India probably needs to revive its leadership in the region, and with Thailand in place, it looked like a better forum, having walked out of RCEP to do it. But I would say the ASEAN Economic Community, with all its manpower, has also been quite slow on delivering. So that's one thing. The other thing you said about, how investors are looking at it, and it directly builds upon the fact that, people don't know BIMSTEC probably. They might know about it now, but it's really hasn't got the kind of international coverage. People know AEC, people know APEC, they know SAARC, which has fallen apart, but they don't know BIMSTEC. So it's only now that, it's being talked about, and these big numbers are out there in terms of the investment or opportunity and how much higher they could be. It's also not very clear, as Dr. Razak said, what does BIMSTEC want? What is its agenda? What are they going in there for? We just got the charter in place, but we're talking about trade and connectivity, but it's clearly not just that. So I really don't think there is an investor perception towards the association per se. It's still very country by country. So you have a view on India, you have on Bangladesh, and you have, on the troubled economies of Myanmar and Sri Lanka and Nepal. So it's like that. Now, to some extent, if I look at it in a segregated manner, India has done well. It's increasing its share in global FDI in no small reason because of the PLI scheme, which has attracted We've actually seen a pickup from US investment coming into hardware and sovereign Indian computers. So that's, the direct benefits of Apple moving its production. You're seeing that, but that's very India specific. It's got nothing to do with increasing its connectivity with other parts of the world or the other parts of Bay of Bengal. But that does bring me to a slightly different angle on the GVCs than what Dr. Mohammed mentioned, because I feel that one reason that RCEP is doing so good or might do so well in the future is because GVCs are naturally there. Supply chains exist within RCEPs. And when you want to relocate your supply chain out of China, there's a natural destination in the region to put it. Whereas BIMSTEC doesn't have that. There isn't a natural supply chain or even the elements for that in place in BIMSTEC. You have to actually start from scratch and rearrange, because some of you are part of other supply chains, right? Thailand is part of the Southeast Asia supply chain. India is trying to become in its own right part of the supply chain, or actually maybe become like China, where you have end-to-end supply chains or things like that. So you have your own motivations there. And you don't really have that kind of domestic spillovers from one economy to the other that could attract investment in the region per se. So I think it's going to be very country by country. There is, at least from an FDI perspective, there is a sense of concern in terms of the economic environment, the policy environment. And I do think it also exists for the larger economies, not just the smaller economies, but yes, to a lesser degree. And we do need to, even in India, keep working towards, strengthening our contract enforcements, I would say. I think that's a big point of contention for foreign investor coming in. And even things like, if I'm looking in the current environment, inflation is becoming a big challenge. Of course, we've done great work, again, in controlling inflation in the region. We were looking, if I look back, double-digit inflation was not such a big deal in this part of the world. We've kept it under control, but we are now again, reaching levels where, institutional ability to control inflation and to, have a stable macroeconomic environment is becoming a question mark in some of these economies. So I think those things really need to be tackled, and it's a more of a question for BIMSTEC than ASEAN, the neighbor that we are comparing it with. And I think those issues really need to be tackled in the absence of a natural advantage, like a supply chain which is in place, which could attract investment. For example, just for an example, you need to have a stable macroeconomic environment, a trustworthy FDI policy to bring in the kind of long-term investment that you want in a sustained manner, not just a one-off spike which kind of peters out. Amitendra, you're on mute.
So sorry. Thank you. I agree with you substantively on that, Priyanka, because I think this subject of supply chains and the connection that it has with connectivity, it's a virtuous connection and it works both ways. Unfortunately, for a large number of reasons, probably it has remained relatively unexplored in the context of the Bay of Bengal region, but that lack of exploration is in a sense hurting the region's prospects, because in other regions around it, it is actually the supply chains which are turning out to be a prime mover of connectivity. And in this respect, I wanted to come back to Tino. Tino, I'm not sort of bringing you onto the table on supply chains, but I wanted to check something with you, that when we look at a region like ASEAN, for example, and when we, let's say, for example, I'm not even getting the European Union into consideration, but ASEAN, or for example, the Pacific Alliance coming out of Latin America, or even a loosely structured organization like the Mercosur and other sub-regions and cross-regions that we have. There have been economies within the region which have acted as poles of economic influence. Let's say, for example, if we look at Southeast Asia, there have been the mature ASEAN economies, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and ably backed by Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, Japan. Similarly, Europe, of course, in a sense, much better than me. I mean, there have been these powerful poles of economic drivers within these regions. We have had so even within Latin America. Compared with all these, when we look at a region like the BIMSTEC, you kind of tend to fall back just on India and Thailand, and perhaps now to an extent Bangladesh, as the economies which need to be in the driver's seat. And fortunately or unfortunately, we assume this, that they should be in the driver's seat, but can they actually be in the driver's seat given their other limitations and external constraints is a subject that we never discuss. What I wanted to check your views on is that, do you think there is a merit in expanding the Bay of Bengal regional identity, whether through BIMSTEC or otherwise, to a broader geography, to bring in, let's say, countries which really have a forward-looking stake into the prospects of the region? It could include Japan, it could include Australia, it could even include, let us say, United Kingdom. It most certainly can include an economy like Indonesia, which really has stakes in the Bay of Bengal region. And there's going to be a lot more of economic recharge, which this idea brings in. Do you think there is a merit in the BIMSTEC stepping beyond what it is right now? Tino?
Thank you, Amitendo. I think it's already happening. There's plenty of space for everyone. But I think that coordination element I mentioned in my introductory remark is critical, right? You do not want to repeat efforts, compete, burden countries with different proposals, initiatives, etc. So the short answer is yes, there's space for everyone. But the long answer is, I think that space could turn out quite competitive and could heat up and could be actually leading to a lot of redundancies and overlaps unless different actors cooperate. And I think, country that I think beyond China has been very active in this has been Japan, especially on the global value chains to connect sort of Southeast Asia, Indochina with the Bay of Bengal, the Andaman Sea via Thailand. That's an interesting, I think, corrective to talk about Priyanka's point that there's nothing really there. You have to build from scratch, basic infrastructure, multimodal infrastructure links. Because you can talk all about possible value chains, but if it takes you days, if not weeks, to for a truck to cross from India to Bangladesh, or no rail link between India and Myanmar, or the absence of deep seaports and quick turnarounds at India's eastern seaports, that potential of those value chains and that manufacturing base and that geoeconomic hub you're talking about, Amitendo, in the Bay of Bengal region will not be realized. We've seen during the early stages of the pandemic, the Japanese government nudging its companies through a variety of instruments to diversify out of China into India. Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. So to diversify out of China into India. Now, if you look at the JBIC annual surveys, which give you a good sense of the sentiment among the big Japanese companies that are investing across Asia, it actually tells you the last 2 years that Japanese companies see that potential in India and the Bay of Bengal region, are constantly looking at and attempting to materialize it, but it ended up being quite risk averse despite the incentives, right? And ended up staying in China, or B, go to other more established Southeast Asian markets, again, as Priyanka has mentioned, that are more integrated and offer the basic conditions for investments and for these value chains that already exist. So therefore, I go back to the point that the basic structural, even transportation, infrastructure, regulatory environment reforms and connectivity initiatives are necessary. And that's where the European Union can support much more. I think there's a lot of interest now from the European Investment Bank, for example, invest in the region. The UK, Amitendo, you've mentioned, which has now come up with its global Britain strategy and is very focused on this area, on the Indo-Pacific from an economic angle again. We mentioned Australia. So I think there's a variety of actors that could be very important in correcting these gaps and supporting countries in the region to become much more integrated and interdependent.
No, thank you. I think ultimately, as you point out, there is clearly not much merit in just bringing countries into taking positions around the table unless and until there is a clear idea about what that expansion is intended to achieve. Because I think today we have reached a point of time in the history of regional integration and its experience where there is a clear understanding of the pros and cons involved, because this is no longer just an economic question, it's a geopolitical question. There are long-term strategic implications. So perhaps what has been done in the past by ASEAN or what has been more recently done by the European Union need not always translate into reproducible examples elsewhere in other parts of the world, and particularly in a region or a sub-region as complex as the Bay of Bengal region. I think I agree with you on that point. And on that, Razak, if I can just come back to you for checking a particular idea. I wanted to turn back to you on this question of the supply chains and the relationship that we are talking about, the way it contributes to connectivity. I think the point that you make, Razak, is very valid in the sense of supply chains essentially being networks and hubs of production. And perhaps the urgency to build supply chains is an imperative for pushing connectivity. As Tino mentioned, that unless you have good points of contact, all-weather roads built connecting India to Bangladesh and Bhutan and Nepal, you can't really expect the supply chains to flourish within the region. And if there's not the India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway, you can't expect those connections to flourish. You can't provide the enabling conditions for supply chains to grow. So this is where, in fact, the interesting question comes up, that can there be a simultaneous movement on both fronts? Because today we are looking at a prospect where there is an effort to enhance capacities in connectivity. At the same time, there is also an effort to reposition and reshore supply chains. Perhaps relocate parts of them back into the Bay of Bengal as a later stage. And at the same time, there is a parallel movement on connectivity which has already taken place over the years that we have seen, which really was not totally cognizant of the idea of supply chains. How do you see this shaping up? I mean, are they exclusive developments, mutually exclusive? If so, then perhaps is there a possibility of bringing them together, make supply chains a more integral part of the connectivity debate? Razak?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for, I think, asking that very pointed and sharp and difficult question. To be honest, I do not know whether I'll be able to answer.
I trust you to provide the answers to difficult questions, always.
Okay, but what I can do, Amita, I can be candid, right? That is my role, and I'm going to do this. First of all, I would like to mention, and I would like to sort of emphasize, this here, and especially amongst, people like us, who would like to see the regional integration to flourish. For them, the key message I would like to mention is this: let's not, dilute, the main objective by bringing in many other issues. We know there are issues of, capacity building. You see, that's the problem, for I think whole of South Asia and also to some extent many countries. Let's be clear about the objective. And for me, the one burning question that we have to deal with: what level of political commitment that we are going to see? Okay, and for me, if you're asking me as a layman, as an academician, as somebody who is trying to find out the meaning out of some numbers, that is not coming out very clearly. See, we can always celebrate, what the summit has achieved in Colombo or in Sri Lanka. To be honest, in my view, I do not see any clear pathway, how the countries they are going to make progress on this. And although I agree with the Ganeshan, the whole idea is certain things can be done, and also Tino has pointed out, But to be honest, I think if Bay of Bengal is going to be successful, they need to come up with one big idea, at least one major thing. Along with it, we can tag along other issues. There are many things like debt issues. But if we're just going to champion, say, debt crisis or debt management, perhaps it's not going to. Nobody's going to listen to you. I think that is a fundamental point that I would like to make. And also, think about the size of the region, like the India, Bangladesh, then of course like other countries like Nepal and Bhutan who have got resources, enormous amount of natural resources that have not been exploited properly for the benefit of the people in this region. Thailand, a good connection between ASEAN and or South Asia. Do you think investment is going to be a problem? The moment the political leadership and the political commitment is clear, I don't think so. And there are many ways of channeling up investment. If certain investment you can generate from globally, certain investment can be coming from within the region. I think that is not taking place. The private sector is not getting the clear response. You ask any private sector representative from the region, do they have got a clear sense of what this particular initiative is going to achieve? No. Perhaps they are not even paying attention to this because they know nothing much is going to happen. So that's why they are not even interested in wasting their time, and they're looking for what is happening elsewhere. Maybe in East Asia, investment opportunities in the UK. That's what the Indian businessmen are trying. They're trying to find out investment opportunities in the UK, right? That's the part of the deal. So I believe, if we're going to undertake a low value and sort of not high priority kind of investment, the whole idea of Bay of Bengal Initiative is not going to go get far away. I think that's my fundamental point. On the supply chain, I believe I owe a kind of clarification is this. I was trying to say that in South Asia we don't have it. We say fine, we understand that, but initially, or any kind of regional integration argument, the whole idea is we need to make the market bigger, and then one approach could be if the countries they are cooperating, that market size then can help with the economic scale, and in the process, the private sector investment, they go materialize, and then we see the benefits of that growth taking place. Even if we're not having the supply chain, somehow we need to find out then how we're going to promote trade, or how we're going to promote the investment connection. What is the incentive for the private sector? I think that is going to be also important. And the other issue is the countries here, they need to find out whether they have got any appetite for further liberalization. I mean, for me, that is not coming out quite clearly. Countries like Bangladesh and even with India, the problem is, it has been extremely difficult, for policymakers, not only in this part of the world, but elsewhere as well, that it is so difficult to distribute the gains from trade. We have seen that has caused, in my view, the tensions within Europe, and we have seen the Brexit, just because people think they're not being equally benefited from the process, and politically and through the policymaking process, there is a difficulty ballgame to distribute the gains from trade or regional integration. So that's number one. But then the issue for us then to find out what then we can do, because any liberalization move you would like to undertake, it will be associated with losses for some sectors, especially in countries like Bangladesh, India, who have got a different kind of I would say comparative advantage in broader terms. So that is why what we call the issues for weaker economies will have to be taken into consideration. How you are going to undertake certain policy options that will benefit maybe Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, in a way that would not be otherwise coming in, just because Thailand and India are very powerful economies that they have. How are we going to deal with this? Unless those things are being clear, I do not say that we can take this further forward. That's my fear about this particular initiative. Sorry, Amita, I haven't been able to answer your question, but I have been honest and candid.
Razak, thank you. You have really given us so many points to ponder, and thank you so much for your meaningful and passionate participation as always. I realize that we have just a few minutes to go, and there are so many more things that we could touch based on. But I want to end the last intervention on this discussion by turning to Ganesh and taking forward this very salient comment that Razak brought to the table. Ganesh, the question of political commitment remains central to the success of any regional project. I think that's a clear view. You have seen the region, you have seen Southeast Asia, you have seen Bay of Bengal. Today, if the BIMSTEC is to succeed, and we are not looking at its capacities, of course, capacities can be addressed only if there is sufficient political commitment. What exactly is the kind of political commitment that you think BIMSTEC needs to move ahead? I'm afraid I can't give you more than 3.5 minutes for that, Ganesh, but I think that's good enough for you. Over to you.
Thank you, Amitendu. I think the way to think of this is to start with, the point that Priyanka raised, that, this institutional light arrangement, I think, and I think Xavier also raised this, so I think we need to go with an institute light model, right? Because we don't have the money and the will to do a big, ASEAN or even more EU style model, right? So institutional light means you have a few rules, you have some coordination, and you have a lot of capacity building, right? And some studies and reports and things like that. I think that's how it has to go initially, right? And that's the way the thing may work. And you formalize some of the rules as you go forward. Now, in such a case, you don't need so much political will. I mean, you need to build up a minimum secretariat. And in the initial way, I think you have to have the 7 people in BIMSTEC working closely with the regional think tank. So I think there should be a formal think tank structure linked to BIMSTEC, okay? And, by think tanks, I mean the broad group. I include Oxford Economics, of course, Priyanka, in this. It's a broad group, not just the academic ones, because you need the practical and the ability to mobilize ideas very quickly. Second, I think, Thailand and India have to put some money behind it, right? Some serious money. And I'm glad Thailand is being the host. And you need some sort of a fund to encourage this kind of work. So it's not, a fund a la SARC where, 5 million, whatever is given, and it's notional and it requires ministers to agree. It's got to be a fund at the discretion of the Secretary General to, get fast moving projects. And, it doesn't have to be big money, attached to kind of doing studies, conferences, ideas, etc., to try to persuade people at the national level. Then I think we have to do a few rules to make it work. And I think, what it was agreed in the Colombo summit is quite nice. We have to get the motor vehicle agreement done properly, the coastal agreement. Those are nice small wins. By the way, one more thing I would add to that would be a Coast Guard cooperation, which I think would be very important, particularly with something that you all would understand, the non-traditional threats, right? There's smuggling, there's people issues, there's drugs, etc. Get those wins going, get some confidence going. And then I think, Razak's point, I think, is fundamental, right? What's in it for the small countries to be in BIMSTEC, okay? If it's just an India-Thailand story, why bother? I mean, we have enough problems in the small countries today, right? So I think, again, some magnanimity is important. And remember from ASEAN, the key issue is that the small countries kind of are seen to be leading the process with the dialogue partners, right? I mean, ASEAN, if you like, leads it with the dialogue partners. And I think that may have to be a sort of a BIMSTEC approach. So I think a light institutional architecture, a lot of emphasis on ideas, the think tank mode, right? With the thing, plus a few rules to make it sound serious, and get some buy-in from the smaller countries. We start baby steps and we might achieve something.
As always, Ganesh, I think I do agree with you that you don't really need a great amount of, political discussion, debate, and convergence to come to achieve a few things which can be done with certainly much less effort, at least as far as the low-hanging fruits are concerned. And I do hope that that might be achieved as we go ahead. And there were so many other questions, thoughts, issues that we had with us, but those, I think, the best option would be, and I consider all of you, along with all my colleagues at ISAS, as part of the ISAS family and the part of the ISAS network. And we would want to come back to you again on this very same subject with a new set of issues, part of which have been raised today and discussed. I note it's exactly 5 p.m. Singapore time, and we do have a reputation for beginning and ending on time. And I am really, really very grateful to all the panelists that we have had with us today for being very economic, sharp, precise, and succinct in your comments. Thank you so much for joining us from various parts of the world, despite all your other difficulties. Thank you so much. May all of you stay well, stay safe and healthy, and we look forward to engaging with you again very soon. And I'd also want to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues at ISAS for their untiring efforts behind these events. And I especially want to thank my colleague Namrata and Jordan, our indefatigable events manager, the one-person army, for steering us forward, and my colleague Yusuf, our IT manager, and the rest of the team who have always worked together. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody who have attended this, and let me now return this back to Namrata.
Thank you, Dr. Palit. On behalf of ISAS, we would like to extend our thanks to all our panelists and our moderator, Dr. Palit, for an engaging and insightful discussion. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Have a good evening, everybody.